Hi, I'm Ann Olson from Heritage University, presenting this paper as part of the International Raymond Carver Society panel at the Midwest Modern Languages Association Conference, November 2014. The title of the paper is Kill Who? Forgiving the Immigrants in Raymond Carver's 60 Acres. Americans have a long history of love-hate relationships among immigrants. We regularly hear news of hate crimes like that of recently executed Mark Stroman, the white supremacist Arab slayer, who, in imagined retaliation against the 9/11 terrorist attacks, shot 3 convenience store clerks in Dallas, killing 2. All 3 were South Asian Muslims. Not one was Arab. Raisuddin Buayan, the Bangladeshi immigrant who survived Stroman's shot to the face, fought to save Stroman from death row to the point of mounting a lawsuit against Governor Rick Perry and the state of Texas, believing that the answer to violence against immigrants is not more killing. Buayan believed that forgiveness and letting go is essential to reconciliation and the healing process. In Raymond Carver's 60 Acres, he explores the long and complicated history of Lee Waite, a fictional Yakama Nation tribal member who is trying to live in peace with whites on reservation land. Waite confronts the descendants of immigrants as they stand for the cause of all his troubles and, like Mark Stroman, takes his gun with the threat to kill the intruders. But instead of violence, Waite opts for a fatherly forgiveness and a letting go. But that doesn't mean the story has a happy ending. What happened between Mark Stroman and his immigrant victims, what happens whenever a native population is forced to deal with a new wave of immigrants into an area, has all played out before in our country. When North European immigrants, Mark Stroman's ancestors ironically among them, stretched their presence and influence across the continent, killing natives and confining them to reservations. When the settlers began reaching the Pacific Northwest, there were tribes who fought, but most battles ended in defeat. Some ended in treaties that still maintain the legal standard for protecting American Indian rights today. The Washington Treaty of 1855 describes 12 million acres of land that the Indians ceded to the government, leaving roughly 1/10 of their original holdings as closed reservation. In exchange, the treaty promises the confederated tribes, including the Yakama Nation near Yakima, Washington, exclusive right to the foods they consider essential to traditional life through fishing, hunting, and gathering in, quote, usual and accustomed places. Their continued access to traditional ways of life was of utmost importance and their main point of treaty negotiation. All tribal treaty signers were learned in oral, not written communication, and they understood the words of the treaty would honor their right to traditional livelihood from their land, quote, as long as the sun shines. In the Yakama oral tradition of their creation story, the Creator decreed that they be protectors of the living bounty, the sacred gifts of these accustomed places, establishing the original covenant between the people and the fish, game, and plant life of that specific area. Chief Meninock in 1915 explained, quote, "I was not brought from a foreign country and did not come here. I was put here by the Creator." Elizabeth Woody further clarifies that this divine directive establishes her, quote, "people of salmon" as being one with the earth. "We are salmon," she says. "We are deer. We are roots. We are berries. We are water. We are the animation of the Creator's wisdom in worship song." The people, as the Creator intended them, were put here to protect these living resources as they would protect themselves, and it was this mutually sustaining and protecting interconnection with their land that they sought to guarantee in the Treaty of 1855, and that the Yakama Nation still strives to protect today. However, tribal signers of the treaty could not have envisioned how their familiar land would look today, 100 years into the future. The towns, fields, cars, and highways, the sheer number of immigrants who would dam the Columbia and fence their, quote, "accustomed places." They could not have predicted the injustice and oppression, the, quote, "social, economic, and environmental repercussions embedded in federal land and water management policies in the Pacific Northwest that would keep most of their people poor for the next 150 years. They could not have foreseen that their sons would come to inherit the embarrassing absurdity of defending a 60-acre plot from white boy duck poachers. Carver's Lee Waite is a Yakama husband and father who is living that absurdity. He reenacts what his ancestors, like Chief Kamiakin, went through in 1855, but on a pathetically smaller scale, choosing to live in peace with the fact of white immigrant intrusion when the alternative would mean endless war and killing. He takes his gun to confront illegal hunters on his land, finds two scared to sobs white boys, and, verging on paternal in his forgiveness, lets them go. Before the letting go, however, in 4 different scenes, Waite feels the pressure of the unspoken message of his family and neighbors to fight, to kill the white intruders as they perhaps should have been fought and killed 100 years earlier upon their first invasion of Indian land. Joseph Eagle is the first one to call on Lee Waite to, quote, "do something" about the men shooting, the 3rd or 4th time this winter someone has been in there, on Waite's part of Toppenish Creek. Waite wishes, quote, the old Indian would let him be about that land, that Eagle would do something else about it if he wanted, besides call. Waite clearly would rather not have to deal with any hunters. Quote, "He wasn't afraid, it wasn't that," he told himself, "he just didn't want trouble." The second appeal comes from Waite's 2 small boys who feel excited as they watch their father take the double-barreled shotgun from the cabinet and a handful of shells. Benny, the oldest, asks, "Aren't you going to load it, Papa?" Waite knows exactly what his sons are hoping for. Quote, "Ever since the call, they had been after him, had wanted to know if this time he was going to shoot somebody. It bothered him, kids talking like that, like they would enjoy it." The next, and perhaps strongest appeal, is from Waite's usually silent mother, who was dozing in a chair by the heat. But when he glanced covertly at her in Carveresque silent communication, quote, She squinted her eyes at him and nodded. He could take the nod as a sign of her approval, of her saying, "Do it this time. We're all behind you, son." But Waite can't be sure what the nod means. In fact, he, quote, was sure she had something wrong with her, because sometimes she went 2 days without saying something, just sitting in the other room by the window and staring off up the valley. It made him shiver when she did that. And he didn't know any more what her little signs and signals, her silences, were supposed to mean. He speaks directly to her, but she will not speak. Quote, "Why don't you say something?" he asked, shaking his head. "How do I know what you mean, Mama, if you don't say?" Waite looked at her for a minute and watched her tug at the ends of her braids, waited for her to say something. Then he grunted and crossed by in front of her, took his hat off a nail, and went out. The final appeal is another nod, but this time its meaning is unmistakable. It comes from another tribal member, Waite's neighbor, Charlie Treadwell. Quote, he remembered what Charlie had told him a few days ago about a fight Charlie had had last Sunday with some kid who came over his fence in the afternoon and shot into a pond of ducks right down by his barn. The ducks came in there every afternoon, Charlie said. They trusted him, he said, as if that mattered. He'd run down from the barn where he was milking, waving his arms and shouting, and the kid had pointed the gun at him. "If I could have just got that gun away from him," Charlie had said, staring hard at Waite with his one good eye and nodding slowly. The "if I could have" phrase is left unfinished. Lee must infer Charlie's meaning from the hard stare and the slow nod, so similar to his mother's squinted stare and nod. What Charlie leaves unspoken is that he could have killed the intruder, could have taken the kid's gun and shot him with it. After all, the kid had threatened him with the gun first, and on his own property. Waite's mother's nod and unspoken message to "do it" made him so uncomfortable that he had to leave the room. And his exchange with Charlie also makes him uncomfortable as he, quote, hitched a little in his seat. He did not want any trouble like that. He hoped whoever it was would be gone when he got there, like the other times. Lee Waite is tired of the burden of protecting the land and the life dependent upon it, dependent upon him. And now there's the added spoken and therefore more powerful burden of this idea that the ducks trusted them with their survival. As if that matters, Lee thinks. And what does the trust of the ducks matter, after all? He had just He had just driven past the entrance to Fort Simcoe, hawking spit in disdain at the permanent symbol of white interests in the treaty settlement. For the local Yakimas, the fort stands as a symbolic gate, blocking historical Yakima trails to Columbia River salmon and confining Indian life to the reservation. Chad Rigglesworth explains how Fort Simcoe represents complex layers of colonial oppression of the Indians. Quote, prior to white occupation, the land at Fort Simcoe was an indigenous seasonal camp near a trail that led to Celilo Falls, a salmon fishing site that was used by the Yakimas and other mid-Columbia River Indians for at least 10,000 years. The U.S. military built the fort to subdue the Yakimas in their wars against white incursion in 1855. Carver set 60 acres on Toppenish Creek, just east of Fort Simcoe, the site of the Battle of Toppenish Creek, October 5th, 1855. On this map, it's marked as Holler's Fight. That was the major holler of the U.S. government forces. This was the first battle in the Yakima Wars of 1855 to 58. Chief Kamiakin won the battle against U.S. Major Holler, driving government forces from Indian homeland back to the Dalles on the Columbia River, killing 5. Tribal forces were later defeated on the west side of the Yakima River near present-day Union Gap and in subsequent skirmishes. On this map you see the crossed swords for the Union Gap fight. That's just south of the city of Yakima today. After the treaty, Fort Simcoe housed the boarding school which forced assimilation and acceptance of allotment farming as a way of life instead of traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering. By 1956, the time of the setting of Carver's story, Fort Simcoe had been designated as historically significant and preserved as a state museum, ironically under a 99-year lease from the Yakima Nation. However, there is no fort or standing symbol to protect the Native American interests in the treaty settlement. In Carver's story, there is only Lee Waite, alone with this burden of his inheritance. Quote, Waite was the one it came down to, all of it. All of it is more than the 60 acres his father intended for his sons. Of his 3 sons, Lee is the only survivor of dire reservation statistics. All of it seems to imply here the whole complicated, unjust history of Indian-white relations, and it makes Waite have to spit. So Waite does what his family and his tribe expect of him. He confronts the treaty breakers, catches them red-handed with their game pockets stuffed with dead birds. Though they are only kids, they still stand as representatives of their great-grandfathers of treaty times, and all their words and lies recall the nuances of the treaty that felt like lies to Waite's ancestors. When Waite asks, "How do I know you wasn't here before?" one boy sobbed, "Word of honor, sir, we never been here before, for God's sake." With all the negative connotations of, quote, word of honor, Carver shifts the atmosphere to reflect Waite's growing anger and the growing danger of the situation. Dark falls, rain drizzles. The drake who survives the massacre at the pond complains loudly, and the trees around them take on awful shapes. And when the boys lie about their names, Bob Robertson and Bill Williams, Waite understands that they are young and scared, but still something in him, his reserve, snaps. He shocks himself with his own intensity. "You're lying. Why are you lying to me? You come onto my land and shoot my ducks, and then you lie like hell to me." In anger, Waite points the shotgun directly at the boys. He even lays, quote, the gun over the car door to steady the barrels. Something about Joseph Eagle, perhaps the thought of how a violent confrontation with whites might affect the old man, alone and vulnerable up there in his lighted house, or perhaps the opposite thought of why should he, Lee, bother with all this while Joseph sits with his feet up listening to the radio. Something causes Waite's crisis to pass, but his knees unaccountably began to shake. He says, quote, "Go ahead and go on." As he watches their taillights fade toward Toppenish, he considers, quote, he had put them off the land. That was all that mattered. Yet he could not understand why he felt something crucial had happened, a failure. Returning home, his wife tells him he did right to let them go, but he looks only at his mother, her black eyes staring at him, as he experiences a kind of cultural deja vu. Quote, he tried to think about it, but already it seemed as if it had happened, whatever it was, long ago. A legal letting go had happened long ago, when Chief Kamiakin experienced firsthand what white word of honor could mean. In 1853, a transcontinental railroad survey team entered the Yakima River Valley, assuring Chief Kamiakin that, quote, Americans had no interest in settling this grassland country. They only wanted to lease a right-of-way across Indian land. Isaac I. Stevens was the survey overseer and soon became Washington Territorial Governor, the one who would force Chief Kamiakin to cede most of his land to the government only 2 years later. Witnesses at the treaty signing in June of 1855 recall that Stevens used intensive persuasion on Kamiakin, saying what would happen if he didn't sign the treaty. Your people will have to kill and be killed until, quote, you will walk in blood knee-deep. Stevens' assistant reported that the severely frustrated Kamiakin finally gave his mark on the treaty paper, saying, take it, quote, if it will do you any good, it is no use to me. Kamiakin's interpreter, Andrew Pamburn, recalled in his memoir that Kamiakin, quote, was in such a rage at the treaty signing that he bit his lips until they bled profusely. What Waite says next to his wife and mother could have been said or thought by Chief Kamiakin in 1855, quote, I should have given them more of a scare. My land, I could have killed them. His mother then speaks her only 2 words in the story, kill who? As if to ask, how many whites would you have to kill and keep killing, son, all the way back to the first white immigrants? Her simple 2-word question speaks to the futility and failure of treaty relations. It speaks to the lost hope of remedy for a history that has placed her family in this absurd, poor, and paradoxical present. We can't go back in time to kill. So we do what Kamiakin did under duress, choose to live in peace or not live at all. Yakima traditional life depends on a whole ecosystem of salmon-filled rivers that connect to the Columbia and then to the Pacific, of free-ranging deer and migratory birds, of seasonal gathering of roots and berries from as far away as the Kittitas and Wenatchee valleys and the Palouse of central and eastern Washington state. The reduction of access to traditional sustenance to a fenced-in rectangular piece of allotted land makes Waite's 60 acres a most apt symbol of what the treaty did not protect for the Indians, what Kamiakin surely suspected. The original treaty sought to maintain sustenance for a traditional way of life, but this 60 acres of tribal inheritance has brought its heirs no feasible way to sustain pre-treaty traditional life. Standing separate from his house, the acreage is, quote, no good to us down there like that. He has inherited only the stress of keeping white hunters from trespassing and poaching. So when he speaks of leasing it to one of the local hunting clubs, his mother can only turn her head and close her eyes. Lease is not a word she can trust. Fort Simcoe stands preserved as a state museum on reservation land leased against the tribe's wishes in 1956. Celilo Falls drowned like Atlantis under the Dalles Dam in 1957, also leased against the tribe's wishes to the federal government under the Reclamation Project Act that, quote, transformed the Columbia River Basin and the area's largest salmon fishery into a hydroelectric empire. When Waite looks up to his shelf and sees the now useless, quote, brown mesh of a gill net wrapped around the prongs of a salmon spear, it represents the tribal loss of Celilo Falls. Waite squints at the netting as though he doesn't even recognize the traditional fishing gear. All the while, his mother's eyes narrowed and followed him. Quote, he turned the spear in his hands and began to unwrap the netting. When his wife asks how much they would get from the lease, he doesn't know and feels confused. When his wife asks, what will Mama say? They both turn to his mother. Quote, but her eyes were closed and she seemed to be sleeping, in a letting go of her own. Her last tie to the land of her father and mother, this 60-acre remnant, is about to be leased, to be given over again to white users. History tells us that Kamiakin found himself criticized from all sides. The whites blamed him for inciting Indians to violence and leading a belligerent Indian confederation. His own tribe, under great stress, divided into factions, with some blaming Kamiakin for leading them into an unwinnable war, and others blaming him for signing the treaty. Waite, too, has no blameless winning way to go. He feels the weight of all of it, so heavy he must lean on the wall. Quote, his legs began to tremble, and his body slides down the wall to a squatting position as he cups his ears with both hands and hears, quote, that roaring like the wind howling up from a seashell. Yakima poets and writers, Earl Thompson, Ed Elmo, Elizabeth Woody, Carol Craig, and Craig Leslie, some who were there the day of the flooding in 1956, tell how the voice of Celilo Falls sounded like wind in the roaring waters of the Columbia River. For Lee Waite and his mother, the 60-acre lease issue is a microcosm of the larger, irrevocable loss of what the Creator originally intended his people to protect. Through this story, we may imagine the 60-acre plot as what it was before the whites came, the land where for 10,000 years the indigenous people camped on the trail to Celilo Falls, the land Kamiakin defended at the Battle of Toppenish Creek, the land where Fort Simcoe still stands on a lifelong lease as a monument to white control, and now the land whose future will go to some local hunting club as one of the only ways to serve his children's livelihoods. Wait is trying to do the right thing, to live in peace with all life on what is left of this sacred, Creator-intended land, even if it means forgiving the ignorant and thoughtless, the falsely entitled descendants of those first treaty-bearing settlers, because the alternative, the unspoken answer to his mother's "kill who," was never a choice.